I was a young man, and I thought being on a steam engine, that was about top of the world for me, you know. I'm Leland Zellers. I was a locomotive fireman for the Illinois Central Railroad back in the years of 1955 to 1964, I think it was.
I'm Rick Morris, engineer for the Indiana Railroad Company. 15 years now, going on 15 years. I'm responsible for everything for the train, running it there safely and making crossings. I mean, just making sure everything's there safe and customers are taken care of.
I started in 1955 on the IC, and just in a few months, the diesels came.
The locomotives are changing, the dynamic braking, different things on the locomotives are always changing. But yeah, I mean, you tell people you run a locomotive regardless what it is, you're an engineer on a railroad, well, yeah, is that mystique, as you want to call it, or professionalism?
It's something that gets in your blood.
I'm fortunate enough, I work right here in my hometown, and I want to start and finish right here.
The only reason that Indianapolis got to be the powerhouse as far as a commercial center that it was is because of the railways and the influence the railways brought. It made Indianapolis and Indiana the crossroads of America. If Indiana was going to be viable, they needed to do more to develop more agriculture on the interior of the state. They needed to make it easier for people to get in.
There were no roads. I mean, there were roads, but they were lousy. They were terrible roads. They were expensive to operate. They were mud. You choked on the dust, or you're up to your knees in mud. So the railroad was the only practical form of transportation that was available.
In 1836, Indiana passed what was called the Internal Improvements Act to help promote the construction of canals and railroads, specifically to make it easier to have access to the interior part of the state.
It was out of that 1836 Internal Improvements Program that the first railroad came, canals came, roads. It was a whole package. It was a transportation package through the whole state.
Before the railroads came along, the canals looked like they were going to be the big thing because it was assumed that the river or the canals would be the backbone of the transportation system, and the railroads would simply be a feeder to that.
Then, between 1850 and 1855, suddenly, rail lines all over the state. It was literally an explosion.
The railroads then came into the central part of Indiana, in the 1850s, filled out the map in the 1860s, and there were little bits and pieces. The funny thing happened is that the railroads, and along with the development of the technology, came a development of a way to fund them.
Many times what would happen is communities were so eager to get railroads to come into their communities, they would actually issue bonds, or they would donate land to the railroad so that the railroad would be induced to come into their particular community. That was very popular all through the 19th century. Local residents really embraced having the railroads because they believed that if their communities were going to grow and going to succeed and draw more people and more industry in, they were going to have better transportation.
A
I think a lot of the courthouse towns, the smaller towns, they thrived because of small industries, because of agriculture, and both of those depended heavily on the railroad.
If you didn't have a railroad, if you were in a community that didn't have a railroad, it was just assumed that you were not a progressive city and that you would just wither away and die.
Illinois Central was the first land grant railroad. It was an interesting deal there. And Abraham Lincoln got involved in this as a lawyer.
Lincoln was an early proponent of railroad expansion. You know, growing up in Illinois as he did, he saw the commerce that was developed in the central part of the state where he lived in Springfield. He did a lot of his early legal work for the Illinois Central Railroad.
With the land grant, you could build on the land that was granted to you by the federal government, but you could also sell it. And if you sold it, then with that money you would use to build the railroad and so on.
It was one of the very few major railroads in this country that was a north-south railroad. Its main route was built from Chicago down through St. Louis, Memphis to New Orleans and Mobile, Alabama.
They had the heavy coal traffic coming out of Kentucky, southern Illinois. In fact, it was the Illinois Central that discovered the coal in Illinois. They also were very big in bringing in materials from South America and Central America. For instance, bananas. Putting bananas on the table in Chicago or St. Louis or Indianapolis.
That was for their original spine from Chicago down to southern Illinois. By the time the Illinois Central looked over into Indiana, this is a period when the big systems were consolidating, trying to stick toes into each other's territories.
I think the IC had probably close to 300 separate little railroads that it took over. And one of them was this line from Effingham, Illinois, over on the main line of the Illinois Central over to Indianapolis. The railroad was built high and dry. It's on a ridge, very nicely engineered. As built, it went over or under everything.
The engineering of the high drive division had to be top notch, I think.
If you build a railroad on the cheap, you're going to be spending money out the ears for the rest of its existence. The more direct you are, the cheaper it is to operate. More expensive it may be to build. So they tried to build this railroad so that it would be pretty direct.
If you look at the original railroad between Effingham, Newton, and Bloomfield, it was very lightly graded. There were not substantial cuts and fills, and by cuts, I mean in order to reduce the gradient, they would cut out large swaths of basically mountains or hillsides so that the tracks could go straight through and not have to go up a steep grade. And then they would use a lot of that extra material then in valleys to basically fill that in so that you'd have a pretty level surface between those different hills. From Bloomfield north to Indianapolis, it's a much more sophisticated engineering that was used with big bridges, big steel bridges, well engineered, well designed.
The tulip trestle out in the middle of nowhere, to get across this just tiny little stream, you have to build a 157-foot high viaduct, 2,000 feet long.
The tulip trestle is quite a structure in itself. I always thought it was a grand place. It's one of the smoothest places to ride across on a train.
There aren't any guardrails. You're rolling along through pleasant, southern Indiana countryside, and all of a sudden the train's out in midair.
You're in awe of it as much as you are of what you're running. But in the fall, there's not a more beautiful picture.
And between Bloomington and Indianapolis, they had to cross a rather substantial hill, not in terms of Rockies, but if you're hauling heavy freight, it was substantial enough that it limited the amount of freight you could haul.
People wonder why they have tunnels on the railroad, because why do you build a tunnel? Well, you don't want to go over that hill.
Well, the tunnel was another structure, and that seemed like a lot longer than it is. I think it's less than 500 feet long, but it seemed like a quarter of a mile or something like that. And you had another trestle before you got to the bottom of the hill even. And probably the most beautiful area on the railroad